Good morning. I'm David Reese, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual meeting of the board. This is the third meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2020 and on or before September 30th, 2021. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Christina DeRose.
Present.
Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Cristian Gonzalez Rivera.
Present.
Leah Goodridge.
Present.
Cecilia Hossa.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Patty Stone.
Present.
Scott Walsh.
Present.
David Reese present. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized renewal lease adjustments will be held this Thursday, May 7th. This virtual meeting will start at 7 p.m. You can obtain information on how to attend this meeting via our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meeting section, or by calling the RGB at 212-669-7480. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on RGB email updates under quick links. Proposed language for the apartment and hotel orders in anticipation for the vote on May 7th was emailed to the board members prior to this meeting. Due to COVID-19 and the state of emergency for New York City, the 2020 annual disclosure filing period will be postponed until further notice. Information regarding the new filing period will be provided as soon as it becomes available. We will begin today's meeting testimony with our owner panel, which is scheduled to go to noon. The board will take a break from noon to 1 p.m. Then in the afternoon, we will hear testimony from the tenant panel from 1 to 3:30 p.m.
Hey, David?
Yes.
Yeah, before we start, just one correction. The proposed language will be emailed after.
Oh, that's right. You had told me that. I forgot to change my
That's
notes.
fine. We didn't change the language. And before we start with our panel, I just wanted to, for our viewers out here, if you're new, I just want to go again to our webpage to show how to give a share so you can sign up for our emails. But hold on one second here. Let me see. All right. Just give me 1 second. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so can everyone see the website? Yes?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So we're on our homepage. If you go to quick links and scroll down to RGB email updates, click there. You'll come to this page. And if you want to subscribe to our email updates, click here. We'll send you to the nyc.gov section where you sign up, and you would choose us off the list here, NYC Rent Guidelines Board announcements. And since I'm here, our 2020 meeting schedule is the quick link as well. You can also get it by clicking meetings up here. And then here. So here are all our meetings. And as you can see, the preliminary vote for May 7th, here is the information that folks need in order to attend the meeting. And we will be posting public hearing and final vote in the coming days as well. And this is where you would find it. So that's what I got, David.
Okay, so Andrew, I'm sorry, I didn't think through the order of speakers. Is that agreed upon already?
It's up to the panelists how they want to handle it. I would throw it over to Vito. He's the one who helped organize with Scott and Patty. So I think probably we'll give it over to Vito and they can choose the order.
Okay, sounds good. Hey, Vito. Oh, Vito, you're muted. Let's see.
Is this better?
Yep.
Yes.
There you go.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Morning.
Nice to see everybody again. It's unfortunate it's under these circumstances, but it is nice to see everybody, and it looks like everybody is doing well. So we're very fortunate for that. So I'd like to lead off our testimony. If everybody's ready, I can begin now.
Great.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Vito Signorelli. I am the Director of Communications of the Rent Stabilization Association, and I am here on behalf of our 25,000 members who own or manage the vast majority of the city's centralized department. We'd like to welcome the new public members of the Rent Guidelines Board and express our desire to engage in a productive dialogue with you throughout this year's deliberations. The coronavirus pandemic has brought unprecedented consequences to New York City, just as our country was in the midst of one of the greatest economic booms we have ever seen. Unemployment numbers were reaching record lows, wages were reaching record highs, and eviction and cash assistance caseloads continued to fall. With the snap of a finger, all of those positives have become an afterthought. Until the time comes when our city's economy is operating at a normal capacity, we are left to wonder how low-income tenants and tenants who have lost their jobs will be able to pay their rent. At the same time, when nearly 40 cents of every rent dollar pays for property taxes and water bills alone, how building owners will be able to pay for their operating expenses if rents are not paid is an equally important question and one that is often ignored. Last June, the state legislature enacted the strongest rent laws ever recorded in the history of New York. While many tenant advocates mistakenly believe that the laws did not do enough, rent-regulated property owners, most of which own buildings that were built pre-World War II, are now left wondering how they will be able to properly invest back into their aging buildings. Within 3 months of the law's enactment, many top-level city administration figures questioned whether the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act may have gone too far. It was also acknowledged by many of these same officials that moving forward, adequate rent increases through the City Rent Guidelines Board would now be necessary in order for building owners to keep up with their ever-increasing operating expenses and maintenance needed for their apartments. As we approached this year's deliberations, we had little doubt that the RGB data would favor the highest rent guideline increase that we have seen under this administration. 4 years ago, we cautioned this board after the first rent freeze in city history that a pattern of zero to minimal rent increases would ultimately affect the bottom line of rent-stabilized building owners. The 2020 RGB reports are now reflecting the effects of those guidelines and will soon reflect the negative impact of the HSTPA. Inadequate guidelines, coupled with consistent increases in operating costs, have now resulted in the first decrease in NOI in 15 years. This is not an anomaly. This will be a pattern moving forward as the board's data begins to reflect the HSTPA, additional inadequate guidelines, and now the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. The notion that all rental property owners are making money hand over fist is not only exhausted, but the furthest thing from the truth. The data provided by the 2020 Income and Expense Study, which as a reminder does not reflect buildings with less than 11 units, cannot be taken lightly. For the last 7 years, we watched the majority of the members of this board focus solely on increased NOI while blatantly ignoring increased operating expenses. Now, NOI has gone down and will continue to deplete as costs continue to rise. Operating expenses have increased faster than building income, rent collections continue to decrease, and the number of distressed buildings has increased for the first time in 5 years. This is no coincidence. RSA acknowledges the severity of the ongoing crisis. We are well aware of the struggles that many tenants are facing as thousands are losing jobs or are left without paychecks while their place of work continues to remain closed. However, the ripple effect of how tenants are dealing with this ongoing crisis is unjustly ignored. It is simple math. When rents are not paid, building expenses cannot be paid. When building expenses are not paid, safe and adequate housing cannot be provided. We are not by any means minimizing the fact that some tenants are in dire need of temporary relief. However, a one-size-fits-all approach by enacting another politically motivated rent freeze does not provide the immediate assistance that some tenants are in need of right now. Because of financial shortfalls in the state and local government, rental subsidies will not and cannot be provided. This is an opportunity for the federal government to step in, and rather than our local elected officials advocating for this much-needed route, they have chosen the political one that only achieves newspaper headlines, such as calling for another rent freeze. Nevertheless, the supplement to the 2020 Income and Affordability Study acknowledges the stimulus payments of up to $3,400 have been issued, and unemployment benefits have been greatly expanded for individuals to make as much as $4,800 per month and as little as $3,400 per month through the end of July. It also cannot be ignored that households with average incomes of $31,000 are earning double the amount of monthly income under increased unemployment assistance, and households averaging $49,000 in annual income are now earning approximately $1,000 more per month under these benefits. Sure, government can do more to aid tenants in this time of need, but these benefits that will continue well beyond the lifting of statewide restrictions can and most definitely should allow tenants to pay their rents and provide for their families. So, while some members of this board have already showed their cards and all but certainly have endorsed the rent freeze, we must ask you this question. Where are the property tax and water and sewer rate freezes? You are blatantly telling the owners of nearly 1 million stabilized apartments that because of an unexpected pandemic, their operating expenses that have already increased will continue to increase, but their only source of income must be stagnant. Furthermore, any proposal of a rent freeze will not go into effect until October 1st, and only a small sample of tenants whose leases expire in the next 5 to 6 months will be able to benefit from a rent freeze for the duration of their lease. How will this recommended rent freeze aid a tenant who is actually unemployed now, whose next renewal may occur between now and September 30th of this year? Not only is it misguided and irresponsible to assume that at a minimum, this current crisis will continue through the end of this year, but it is also irresponsible to assume that tenants will continue to remain unemployed throughout that entire duration. Rent freeze or not, regardless of when it would go into effect, the rent will still be due. And another politically motivated rent freeze will do nothing to alleviate the burden that existed for all low-income tenants prior to the pandemic. However, should this independent board continue to feel the pressure, politically or otherwise, to freeze rents, then a rent freeze should be as short as possible, affecting leases only between October 1st, 2020 and December 31st, 2020, in order to limit the damage to the housing stock, which is this board's primary responsibility. For over 50 years now, this board has had a duty to grant rent-stabilized apartment owners reasonable rent guidelines to offset the ongoing increases in building operating costs and mandates. The members of this board are required to consider the studies that have been put before them based on data from the last 2 years. Until this flawed RGB process is altered, this is and should continue to be the responsibility of this independent board. The data from this year's price index and income and expense study is more than enough justification for this board to put an end to politically motivated rent guidelines. It is undoubtedly time to reverse course and provide a realistic rate of rent increase. By freezing rents again in the face of ever-increasing operating expenses, in addition to the effects of the Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act and the coronavirus pandemic, you can guarantee that data in subsequent RGB studies will show the expedited deterioration of the city's already aging housing stock. We urge the RGB to adopt a range that reflects the commensurate rent increases that RGB research suggests as necessary increases: 2.5% to 4.5% for a 1-year lease and 3.5% to 5.5% for a 2-year lease. Furthermore, pursuant to clarification issued by DHCR last fall with regard to the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, these renewal guidelines should also apply to vacancy and renewal leases. These guidelines would be a starting point for owners to recoup the recent inadequate guidelines, the draconian changes to the state's rent laws, and reverse the recent trend in which the RGB's own commensurate rent adjustments have been deliberately ignored over the last 6 years. We look forward to working with all members of this board and will continually remain available to any questions or requests from each of you throughout the deliberation process. On behalf of our entire membership, I thank you very much for your time and consideration. I'd like to note that as I was reading my testimony, I realized that I had not sent my testimony to Andrew to share with the staff ahead of time, so I apologize. I will do that right now, and I am open for any questions.
Thank you, Vito. Any questions for Vito from the members?
Vito, can you for the new members just go over a little bit of your small owners and the kind of varying types of owners who your trade association represents, just so people can have you might have touched on it at the beginning, but I think it'd just be helpful to have a little more context.
Of course. So out of our membership, our membership ranges from large owners to small owners, but the vast majority of our membership, I'd say anywhere between 70 to 75% are owners of smaller buildings, less than 11 units, but also anywhere between 1 and 20 units on the higher end of that, of older buildings. And these are mom and pop operations. Most of them are generational immigrant owners who have taken on these buildings from their parents and their parents before them.
Any other questions? And we certainly can come back to Vito as other speakers speak as well, but any other questions?
Yeah, so Vito, thank you for your testimony. So you referenced that, that there's a lot of benefits that have come for tenants as well. It's like specifically unemployment insurance. It's like we haven't seen the numbers in cash assistance, but presumably that's up as well. So certainly, it's like we're sort of setting up a situation where tenants are using those benefits to possibly pay rent. What possibility do you think exists for landlords to receive some kind of relief, whether that's sort of expanded mortgage forbearance or some other kind of relief on your side?
Well, as I mentioned in my testimony, our owners, in terms of operating expenses and bills, it comes down to property taxes and water and sewer rates that take up the most of building operating expenses. And we've heard many elected officials call on, rent forgiveness. And like I said, our owners are very understanding of what's going on right now. It's a shame that in the media, the portrayal of good property owners who are working with their tenants to not force the rent to be paid on the first of the month and come up with a program to and an individually model to help them pay over time and work with them to get through this. It's not represented well in the media. If in the event there was, an opportunity where a tenant could not pay rent at all, and it was acknowledged by our elected officials, it would certainly be offset by the same kind of forgiveness for property tax payments and water and sewer bills.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a possibility? Specifically, considering that property tax bills are sort of within the power of government and also utility rates can be set by government, do you think that's possible, that there could be some relief there?
Do we think it's possible? Yes. However, since this pandemic began to worsen back in March, our organization called upon these elected officials to, at a minimum, talk about the possibility of such forgiveness for these operating expenses. And it's gone by the wayside. These elected officials have downplayed it and not brought up the possibility of, okay, well, if there was some type of rent forgiveness, then maybe we could provide some forgiveness to owners for their operating expenses as well. But it hasn't been mentioned. And unfortunately, we don't see that coming up on any level of government in the near future.
Okay. What kind of a difference do you think? Of course, you sort of have an estimated number for how much the rent should increase on 1 year and 2 year leases. How much help do you think? It's how much of a decrease, let's say, it's like in property taxes or in utility rates. It's like, do you have some kind of an estimate as to what kind of help you would need on that side?
It's difficult to say because, property tax rates vary, by neighborhood. Each building owner is paying their own, type of property taxes. You can have a building that's 50 units in one part of the city that's paying X amount, and then a building that's 6 units in Lower Manhattan that's paying even more than that just because of the location of their buildings. So it's really difficult to say. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. It would have to be determined based on building size, rent roll, how much rent in that particular building is an owner missing out on because of tenant situations. You can have a building, whether it's completely rent stabilized or not, where all the tenants are employed and paying their rent. At the same time, you can also have another building where, half of the apartments are rent stabilized and half of the apartments are free market, but the vast majority of the tenants have lost their jobs and are unable to pay rent. So it's difficult to determine how much would be able to offset. It's really, it's individual situations, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you.
Vito, a question. Do you know what percentage of your members have mortgages on their property? And to what extent they have mortgages that are guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac or FHA?
So at the moment, we don't have the data on that. It's very difficult to gauge our membership in participation for surveys to reach out in terms of this. We have run surveys in terms of rent collections, and we've received minimal responses on that, but at least it gave us an idea of where some of our members are. But at the same time, they have acknowledged that their rent collection is vital to the paying of their mortgages. Unfortunately, we don't have a breakdown of whether they are federally funded or not.
Vito, what is the possibility of using the security deposits for arrears, the rental arrears?
So we know that's been mentioned a lot over the last couple of months. We've issued guidance to our members in terms of what they should do for rent collections. It's not something we're saying, hey, you should definitely do this, because this is also it's not a one size fits all approach. However, we've given them the option of, hey, if this is going to help your tenants meet a monthly rent, you should definitely come up with a plan in writing with your tenant to use a security deposit to cover a month's rent, and some type of system where it's replenished over time so that the security deposit is still there along the lines. This is just one of the many items of guidance we have given our members. We're not telling them, hey, this is what you have to do, but it is an option if a tenant is in a particularly bad situation where they've been unemployed for some time now because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Other questions for Vito, or else, if not, we can move on to the next speaker.
I have a question. Vito, you mentioned during your testimony that the board has made political decisions. And I wanted some elaboration on that, because that is something that has been stated for the last couple of years. And I wanted some elaboration on that, particularly in the context of, we all know the numbers of how many homeless New Yorkers there are. We all know the eviction numbers. We all know that the rents in New York are pretty high. So I'm wondering where is the political decision?
I'm sorry, Leah, I missed the last part of your question. There was some background noise.
Oh, so we all know the figures. So I think that is just numerically. So and certainly the board does rely in part on those figures. So I'm wondering, where is the political decision coming from that you mentioned?
Well, it's no secret that the mayor has come out and said he wants the board to enact a rent freeze. But in a world where I'm sure we all wish we were living, where this pandemic never happened, the data that has been provided from this year's RGB studies would show greatly improved economic conditions for tenants and depleted NOI for building owners and increased operating costs. I mean, these are all things that would suggest, larger increases in rent. But to come out and say the board should enact a rent freeze because of a pandemic, and say that the data from this year's studies are misleading is just convenient. We do understand what tenants are going through, and help and temporary relief should be provided. However, we strongly believe that it's not this board's responsibility to provide that.
To provide to, sorry.
Go ahead, Leah.
So just to clarify, you don't think that it's the board's responsibility to provide relief in the form of a rent freeze at all.
Correct.
Okay.
Other questions for Vito? Vito, who's next amongst the speakers?
I can go.
Hey, Ping.
Hey, David. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Payman Lothy with the Real Estate Board of New York. Thank you to the Rent Guidelines Board for the opportunity to provide our perspective regarding rent adjustments for the city's rent-regulated apartments. New York has been acutely affected by the unprecedented COVID-19 crisis, not only from devastation to public health, but also an upending of virtually every aspect of society. New Yorkers worry about their jobs and financial health, their ability to keep a home and food on the table. REBNY recognizes the affordability and homelessness challenges of this city and recognizes the impact of COVID-19 will only exacerbate both for many months. That's why REBNY members were the first to pledge a 90-day moratorium on evictions, enter into voluntary rent payment plans, and have tenant assistance programs for those with verified hardship. Individual pain requires a compassionate and individualized response. The scope and scale of this crisis is one that can only be adequately addressed by federal resources. REBNY has been an aggressive advocate for New York City at the federal level, pushing for business interruption programs, state and local aid, reforms to expand the Paycheck Protection Program, and an emergency rental assistance program. An expansion of a rental voucher program is of critical importance as it is the most direct way to appropriately relieve housing cost burden for New York's most vulnerable populations. The Rent Guidelines Board should be commended for the vast information they provide and the clarity with which they present the many challenges in the data. Those challenges have led to a system ill-equipped to match appropriate rent increases with expenses over time. The rate of RGB allowed rent increases is not kept up with the rate of annual expense growth. Over a 20-year period of time and across multiple mayoral administrations, RGB increases averaged 2.6%, while expenses for property owners increased more than twice that rate, at 5.6%. This incongruence is a result of a highly politicized process that relies on a flawed methodology that artificially inflates NOI and arbitrarily reduces expenses. An outdated 28-year-old analysis by the RGB and the Department of Finance is used as a basis for adjusting expenses downward 8%. Similarly, costs of building facade maintenance, increased elevator inspections, lead paint abatement, and any other government mandates imposed since the price index was updated 36 years ago are not considered by the board. Further inflating reported NOI is the universe of buildings that the RGB studies. The RGB excludes data on smaller 1 to 10 unit buildings that leaves nearly 16,000 fully stabilized buildings unaccounted for, while simultaneously including predominantly market rate buildings with abated property taxes through programs such as Affordable New York. Finally, the data collected to determine rent increases has a 2-year lag and does not include dramatic policy changes that substantially change the economics of operating apartment buildings. The changes enacted last June as part of the HSTPA of 2019 included the effective wholesale elimination of increases beyond those provided for by the Rent Guidelines Board at lease renewal, including the Vacancy Allowance, Rent Guidelines Board increases at vacancy, major capital improvements, individual apartment improvements, luxury decontrol, and preferential rents. As a result, the burden to maintain quality housing amid escalating costs falls solely on the RGBs via annual rent increases. As we shared with the board last year, an analysis suggested that the HSTPA could dramatically change the economic viability of the operations and maintenance for apartment buildings across the city. Their analysis estimated that within 5 years, approximately 272,000 units could be financially distressed and unable to afford any investment beyond basic maintenance, taxes, and utilities. Unfortunately, the RGB's research does not account for the sweeping legislative changes of the HSTPA. However, preliminary research suggests there are some early warning signals that owners are undertaking substantially less work and investing less in the city's regulated housing stock. A Wall Street Journal study of the City Department of Buildings permits found that property owners started 535 fewer renovations in rent-regulated buildings between July and November of last year, which represents a 44% decline and a $71 million fall in renovation spending. Additionally, REBNY's investment sales report for the second half of 2019 found a significant decrease in investment of rent-stabilized buildings, with total dollar volume declining 73% year over year, from $5.7 billion to $1.6 billion. With 71% of the rent-stabilized housing stock built prior to 1947, maintenance and operational costs are a fact of business, with regular cycle of necessary major system overhauls like gas, electricity, water, boiler, elevator, and roof replacements. According to the RGB's income and expense report, owner expenses increased 5.8%. Property taxes comprise the largest share of owner expenses, averaging 30.4% of all costs amongst rent-stabilized buildings. From 2017 to 2018, the average monthly expense per dwelling unit paid towards taxes increased 7.9% and have more than doubled since 2007. In spite of a methodology that results in an overstatement of a building's NOI, this year's RGB income and expense study shows a 0.6 decrease in NOI for the first time since 2003. It is no secret that this process and historic results are ones that landlords and tenants alike find frustrating. The rapid adverse changes COVID-19 wrought on the market and housing landscape lend additional credence to serious consideration moving to a new standard formula that inputs various indices for generating RGB increases that can operate independent of political machinations. This board's determinations should be the result of a consistent, predictable, and transparent framework year to year to provide predictability in balancing tenant and landlord needs. Public input is an important part of good government, and it should be used to provide data discrepancies, new methodologies, or to highlight sudden shifts in the market. A 2-year lag in data is unacceptable most years, and more so today. We continue to believe there are merits to a formula system, and therefore suggest a formula that encompasses the following: consumer price index and wage growth, property taxes, unfunded regulatory requirements, and subsidized regulatory requirements, labor, maintenance, insurance, administrative costs, capital investment needs, debt service, and utilities such as energy, water, sewer, and fuel. Rental income and capital investment are the lifeblood of rental housing. Rental housing with a steady and reliable stream of income is sustainable, and conversely, tenants suffer by decreased building quality and services when revenue is lacking or constrained by unrealistic restrictions on rent growth that are not sufficient to accommodate increasing expenses. For multiple years, this board under this administration has weighted tenant needs over rising expenses, with the biggest driver of those expenses being increases to city property taxes. This deficit was previously balanced by other statutorily available revenue streams beyond RGB annual increases. Now that the state has eliminated those revenue streams with the passage of the HSTPA, the role of the RGB is more critical to maintaining the economic viability of the city's rent-stabilized apartment stock. The 2020 Rent Guidelines Board PIOC study found that increases between 2.5% to 3.5% for 1-year leases and 3.3% to 6.75% for 2-year leases are required to maintain owners' current dollar NOI. REBNY recommends a minimum of a 2.4% increase for 1-year leases commensurate with the weighted increase of expenses dedicated to property taxes. It's fair to consider the difference between 1- and 2-year leases. However, the board's guidelines must apply to both renewal and initial leases moving forward. Rightfully, there are a number of regulatory provisions related to health and safety that must occur at turnover, including lead abatement and painting, that are not permitted as an IAI expense. The majority of apartments do not utilize preferential rent, and absent a guideline applying to initial leases, will not have a chance till 2021 to even recoup a portion of those required costs, which may now include heightened cleaning procedures related to COVID-19. The city has been experiencing an affordability crisis that impacts hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, both in and out of rent-stabilized housing for decades. We will not know the full impact of COVID-19 for some time, but the numbers are deeply personal. During this time of crisis, property owners have gone above and beyond in meeting their responsibility of providing quality and safe housing for their residents. They continue to and must find ways to cover the increased costs for utilities and maintenance, along with the other already burdensome financial obligations they have, including property taxes. Additionally, at a time in which many of us are at home, building owners have worked to ensure buildings are safe, clean, and responsive to COVID-19 pandemic, often at a significant expense. New Yorkers deserve responsible policies that support existing high-quality rental stock and allow for property owners to meet their financial obligations in order to maintain a functioning housing ecosystem. We must collectively ensure property taxes are paid to the city for vital programs, and now is not the time to absolve responsibility for meeting statutory requirements. All must share in the responsibility of keeping the housing market stable. Thank you to the members of the Rent Guidelines Board for considering our testimony. That turn over to any questions.
Questions for Payman?
I just wanted to clarify. Rebney had was it 2.4% recommendation for 1 year? Did they have a recommendation for 2 year? Did I miss that?
I think what we had said is that at minimum, it should be a 2.4% just based on the commensurate data for property tax increases. And, David, I want to go back there. There was a board member who asked a question about federal assistance. Christian, I think it was you. We have been working on the federal level to identify ways in which all New Yorkers can receive the benefit and the aid that they need. Right now, in terms of aid to property owners, there really isn't any. The Paychex Protection Program explicitly excludes real estate interests. The Mortgage Forbearance Program is really only applicable to those who have residential mortgages that are federally backed. So if you think about the universe of multifamily housing, most of them have commercial mortgages. Really, I think the numbers that came out nationwide is that this forbearance basically offers protection to 25% of multifamily units. But that's nationwide, where you have a lot smaller buildings that have residential units in them. Like, think about your 1 to 4 families, which perhaps they have residential mortgages. In New York, that number is probably going to be much higher.
So sorry, go ahead, David.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Christian.
Okay. So thank you, Payman, for those, for basically, it's like I'm very interested in the idea that, it's like there's other information that could be brought into our process to really think more holistically about what our decisions should be moving forward. But along those same lines, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal analysis showing a decrease in renovations. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's like I imagine that these renovations also include sort of elective renovations, sort of renovations that aren't crucial to maintaining sort of health and safety in these buildings, that are, sort of improvements to the lobby, et cetera, that sort of thing. It's like, do you think that there's but correct me if I'm wrong about that. I see Scott that's shaking his head. But it's like, do you think that there's a danger right now? It's like, given the way that NOI has been moving over the past 5 years, that there could be substantial lack of renovations that would impact the health and safety of tenants?
Yeah,
and to what level as well?
That level. So the point of sharing that data was to go back and say, there are limitations here to RGB's data. And, it operates on a 2-year lag. So we're not, that all the numbers that, the board is considering right now doesn't even reflect all of the sweeping changes that took place as a result of the HSTPA. But, there are some data points that are more recent, like the Wall Street Journal that reported on permits, and our own investment sales reports based on like how much investment dollars are going into rent stabilized buildings, to demonstrate that these changes are quite impactful. I mean, both of them are around 75% decrease in activity. So, I raised both of those points to illustrate that the HSTPA changes were quite sweeping and quite dramatic, and that we're going to, it'll bear out in the data a few years from now. I would just say that, 2 years is going to be too late. We need to acknowledge that there were a lot of changes that occurred just less than a year ago that the board needs to consider.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's like by the question, I was just sort of trying to tease out, what are the indicators of these properties being less profitable than they were, and what are the indicators of signs that these properties might actually be distressed? It's like, which is of course something that everyone has interest in avoiding.
Our initial analysis last year of the changes was that there were going to be about 270,000 distressed units throughout the city as a result of these changes.
Mm-hmm. And of that analysis, how much of that distress comes from perhaps refinancing that expected a higher rate of return versus actual inability to sort of meet maintenance costs of the buildings? How does that split up in terms of?
Typically lending activity is done based on current rent roll. It's not based on projected or aspirational figures, right? So, that's all based on the underwriting process, and typically it's conservative. I think, maybe it's not sympathetic to hear it from the landlord groups, but we are sharing information that is real, which is that expenses keep going up and up, and there's going to be faults in the economic viability of these assets as a result of 0% increases in rent freezes or minimal increases. And now with other revenue streams basically being eliminated by the state, the board has a greater burden to provide relief.
Well, thank you, and thank you again. It's like for sharing that. So
yeah, and it's important to remember that a majority of the rent stabilized buildings were built prior to 1947, right? So these are older buildings that require a great deal of maintenance and capital.
All right, thank you.
I'd just like to add one thing just for Christian's benefit. The MCI program has definitely been dragged through the mud with the law changes last year, but the MCI program did not allow an owner to do a gold-plated wallpaper renovation of a lobby. It was truly for infrastructure items. So, decorative items were always excluded from the MCI. So there wasn't a way that an owner could arbitrarily, upgrade their building in some kind of, incredibly fancy way on the backs of a tenant. This was for boilers, roof, this was for really kind of critical items. So, no one likes to have to bear the cost of what it costs to do things, but we obviously have a very strong union presence in New York, and that pay living wages, and it costs money to build things when you pay people in living wages. So I think in a lot of ways we've done the right thing, but in other ways, those costs come out in many, many places.
And Scott, that's a good point, because it's the board. You guys have a lot to consider, right? and balancing tenant and owner needs. But, you know, there will be, in terms of economic impact, there will be job loss associated if this is not done responsibly. And to Scott's point about building service workers and union wages.
I just wanted to make a quick point, 2 quick points. The first is, definitely as a tenant attorney, we have seen where there have been abusive MCIs and IAIs. What we see often as tenant advocates is, unless the person has an attorney, they are often not aware of how to defend against them by answering to DHCR. But we do see oftentimes where, you know, there will be thousands of dollars worth of an alleged MCI for, you know, a boiler fixed, but then the tenants still have no heat. So we definitely do see rampant abuses. And then my second point I just quickly wanted to make was that it has been mentioned a few times, so I feel the need to comment about the new rent laws, PTA, sorry. I think we need to be cautious about using the new rent reforms as reason and justification to increase rent, right? Because these in reality are protections of tenants for abuses that that tenants have endured for many decades. And so we're talking about going on blacklists, we're talking about MCIs, the same that I just mentioned. And so these are to protect and correct abuses that have gone on. So, you know, there is no balancing the scale. So you wouldn't say if a law came to protect people who have disabilities from getting jobs, you wouldn't say, okay, well, now that there's that law, now we have to balance the scales for other people who don't have disability. The whole purpose the whole purpose of the law is to balance the scales already, because they were already tipped over. So I just want to caution about using the new rent laws as reason to justify for
Yeah,
rent.
maybe you misunderstood me. You know, REBNY absolutely supports greater transparency in the system, which were, you know, some of the changes as part of HSTPA. We also, you know, supported right to counsel. The point in raising the other reforms related to HSTPA was strictly to talk about it in terms of revenue streams to building owners and how they, you know, how they can meet rising expenses. You know, I go back to my testimony. Over a 20-year period of time, RGB averages rent increases of about 2.5%, while, you know, expenses have increased over 5%. And the reason why that that difference was tenable, it's because, you know, owners had other tools at their disposal, whether that be vacancy allowance, individual apartment improvements, major capital improvements, high rent decontrol or luxury decontrol, preferential rents. Now all of those other streams of revenue are shut off. And it's creating an environment in which people cannot maintain their housing unless the Rent Guidelines Board increases. And that's why the burden falls a lot more on you guys this year to help balance that scale economically.
I have 2 questions. To what degree have you estimated the effect of the COVID crisis, as well as the government response so far, on the ability of rent stabilized tenants to pay rent? And my second question, which is related, is how has the COVID crisis and the government response affected your recommendations in terms of rent increases? In other words, what would it have been 3 months ago compared to now?
You know, I think it's important that we discuss the rising expenses that are as a result of you know, government action. And so that's why it makes sense to make rent increases commensurate at minimum with property taxes. But, you know, you've heard from others that there are significant costs resulting from increases to water rates, utility rates, et cetera. You know, in terms of your, to answer your first question, we do know that rent collections are down, which places greater stress on the economic viability of these buildings. We also know that the expenses are increasing as a result of, additional cleaning as a result of the public health pandemic that we've got right now. So I'd just say it's probably too early to give you an accurate, number of what the costs are. But I do know that collections are down and expenses are up.
Can I also say something in response to Leah's comment? I think it's critical to note about the sweeping changes from the new rent law, and the new board members should understand that at a time when an owner could have possibly helped tenants by giving them a preferential rent, they can no longer do that, because now, based on the new law, the preferential rent has to last their entire tenancy. And at a time when owners could have been making some money back for rents that they were losing with luxury deregulation, which didn't affect the vast majority of rent stabilized tenants, the owners no longer have that option either. So the new rent laws definitely did overly shift the balance. And I'm not saying that there weren't a few bad apples in the bunch that needed to be watched, but the vast majority of owners, very vast majority of owners, follow the law and do what they're required to do. So bringing up the new rent laws is a factor here, because the new rent laws went way too far. And now when there are tenants that can't pay, the owners have no way to overcompensate or to help them, whereas they would have before the new rent laws.
Payman, I have a question about the formula that you propose in your testimony. So you're saying that the RGB relies on too much older data, and they analyze the data as soon as it's made available to them, but there is a lag with some of the data. I'm curious about your system. There is some overlap with data that the board considers, such as utilities and labor and maintenance costs, but then you throw in some other metrics, capital investment needs, debt service. Is REBNY prepared to kind of flesh this out and kind of propose some new metrics and demonstrate that there are data sources that are objective and available to analyze to look at these additional factors that you've identified?
Yes.
We look forward to seeing that work.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And David, I think the other part of it is the data set that RGB analyzes is incomplete, right? You've got 16,000 buildings that are fully stabilized, that are under 11 units, that are not accounted for, and they don't have the benefit of market rate units to help subsidize their costs, right?
Payman, I think we've discussed this before, but my understanding is that the city doesn't collect data on those buildings, and so there's a gap in the data, but it's just one that we can't fill. Am I wrong about that?
No, it's a problem. Yeah, we have discussed that.
Yeah, so it's imperfect data, but it's not like the staff is ignoring data that's out there. It's just the data doesn't exist for them to analyze.
Yeah, but there might be a way to make adjustments. The board makes adjustments downwards on expenses and artificially inflates NOI, right? So there may be ways to make adjustments to the data that you do collect to more accurately represent the universe of rent stabilized buildings, right? So potentially you've got a building that's 20% stabilized, 80% market, and has got a tax abatement, and that one's treated just the same or that one's given more weight than the building that's fully stabilized and smaller, under 10 units.
And we would certainly welcome any kind of critique to the methodology that makes appropriate adjustments.
Hey, David, just for point of clarification, that's with our income and expense study, but our price index of operating costs is for all buildings that are containing stabilized building units, rather. So that only applies to the income and expense study, and our commensurate rent adjustments are done through the price index.
Andrew, just a quick follow-up question. Have we scheduled a opportunity for DACR to come and testify for us? Because I think there were a few points made by owner folks who are representing owners around, like, you know, the impact of the rent laws, which, you know, I'm assuming DACR has. You know, there were comments made about MCIs not, you know, being, you know, dragged through the mud. And I, you know, we haven't actually gotten directive from DACR on what they would consider at MCIs right now, because the law is a little bit vague. And so they haven't issued any public memo around it. And so I wonder if we could have them come and shine some light on that process, as I know that they're supposed to have issued some memo and some directive as of, I think in June, they are supposed to by law say something about like some of the rent laws and how they're going to implement these things. And so I wonder if we could have that so that we can have, you know, the anecdotal comments made by owners, but also like see the data that we have seen for, you know, decades of MCIs being, you know, close to $1 billion just in the last, you know, decade, I think, if I'm correct, from the last report that we saw from them. And so I just wonder what we think that world will look like and get data from DACR directly. Of course, that isn't going to include the, you know, 6 and under units that are not registered with DACR, that are not rent stabilized, but you know, I think it could shine some light to a lot of the comments made today, which I honestly have not seen, you know, data to back up. And so I would like to get, you know, sources of data from folks specifically around the rent laws. You know, there was a some comments around the security deposit, which I feel like I would like for us to have shared clarity on, of like what does that look like, and like the potential impact of that. We talked about distressed buildings, like 270,000 units will be distressed as a result of the rent laws. We're not seeing that from data because it's a little bit older, but is the city seeing more reported cases of no heat and hot water, repairs not being made in the city, specifically now, even during COVID, which, you know, I personally, working on the ground in the Bronx, am currently not seeing a ton of. And so I wonder, you know, if we can get data to some of this information so that it's not sort of hanging in the air as like completely factual, which I don't actually believe they all are.
Shayla, to respond, we, you know, each year we send an annual list of questions to HCR before they come and testify. So those have been sent to HCR with updates to ask, you know, what's happened since June. Just caution you that the registration data is from April 1st of 2019. So some of the data won't be reflective, but MCI data, for example, would be. You know, how many MCIs have been applied for after June, the amount that was approved, the amount that was applied for, those kind of things that we can ask. So we have asked HCR to do that. So hopefully I know they're working on them, and they're, you know, just like everybody else, they're, the ability to do things quickly has been slowed down a bit since the health crisis, obviously. So, but they are working on those. And currently, you know, there is no other meeting scheduled here. So to have them come and invite, that's something that I guess we could talk about later on in the meeting. So, but to answer your question, those have been put forward. And if board members have additional questions, I can send those questions around. And then I could forward them to HCR.
Other questions for Payman?
Oh, sorry. What's the deadline for questions? Submitting questions to you for HCR?
Yeah, you know, whenever you want to, you know, submit a question, that's fine. I could just forward it. You know, I may wait till I get, you know, the board members to respond. So I guess maybe a week from today, but I'll send that around with an email, and I'll show you the questions that have already been asked. And for the new members, there's sort of the same questions are asked each year, just to for we can keep a tally or a history of what's going on with these different type of things, so we can see trends over time. And we put that in a table, and I can send that, the latest memo around regarding that we did last year to see where we're at. So I'll send the questions around in that memo. And then hopefully HCR will be able to get us data. But I believe they will. It's just they are working on it.
All right, thank you.
Maybe, I mean, I don't just think that we want the standard numbers we're getting. It was just we're getting anecdotal we're having an anecdotal conversation around the impact of some of the rent laws, but I have not seen, you know, the DHCR's position on what is currently considered an MCI. They aren't processing that I know of any new are making decisions. And we've been tracking some of that in buildings that we personally are working in. And so I just wonder if we could be getting more information on them. Like, do they have, you know, there was a few things were mentioned around preferential rents, MCIs, IAIs, you know, other rental increases. Like, could we get data on like what they're making decisions on right now in order for us to use that to move forward? Yeah.
Shayla, I mean, owners, the people who've spoken so far, with all due respect, represent thousands of buildings in the city. So to say that their testimony is anecdotal, I would not say that to any of your people. So I think that's, you know, a bit far reaching. It's not anecdotal when they represent thousands of owners.
Thank you, Scott.
More questions for Payman? Okay. Who's next, Vito? Hey, Joe. We can't hear you, Joe. Hold on. Oh, there we, how about now?
Is that better?
Yep.
Very good. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I also did not send my electronic testimony to Andrew, so I will send that after this meeting to be distributed. So I'll just sort of get into it. You know, my name is Joseph Condon. I'm providing this testimony on behalf of the Community Housing Improvement Program, also known as CHIP. CHIP is a not-for-profit association. We focus on education and advocacy for rent-stabilized property owners. Most of our members are small to medium-sized property owners, buildings throughout most of the 5 boroughs. Our members run pretty much hands-on small businesses. They manage their own buildings. They own their buildings long-term. They become fixtures within the communities. More than 50% of our members have owned their properties for 20 or more years. So they're not speculators. They're the long-term investors and part of the fabric of communities. They also sit on local clubs or civic associations. Some sit on their community boards. So they are really part of the community. I also think I just wanted to, it was sort of touched on before, but I wanted to highlight the fact that CHIP member buildings and about 90 to 95% of all the stabilized housing stock are pre-1974 construction. So most of them are pre-47, but there are some pre-74. But all of these buildings that are pre-74 are rent stabilized just because they were built before that date, January 1, 1974. They are not stabilized in exchange for government benefits, tax subsidies, abatements, low rate financing, and regulatory agreements. There is no quid pro quo. They're stabilized just because of the construction date. And so that means when operating costs increase and there isn't any commensurate rent increase to cover those costs, those owners don't have those expense offsets to sort of help them out. They still have all the expenses to deal with. And what I'm saying is these pre-1974 owners only have this board to rely on for the viability of their buildings. The guidelines passed by this board are the only method they have for keeping up with increases in operating costs. I mean, we understand that this is an unprecedented time. Unemployment numbers are skyrocketing. Businesses are closed. Streets are empty. People are struggling financially. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. And in light of that, you know, our members have been working individually with some of their tenants who have reached out and who have been in some of that financial difficulty, and they have worked with them individually. But we ask this board to stay true to its mission, use the data that's in front of them. And while the economy may look different right now than it did last year, what's certainly not different at all are the expenses for the building. Those are still the same. COVID-19 or not, these rent stabilized properties still have to operate. Property taxes, water sewer payments, mortgage, utilities, fuel, labor, payroll, insurance, repairs, the list goes on. Unprecedented unemployment levels have been met with unprecedented employment benefits, expansions, additional monies. And I know we sort of talked about it a little bit, but more COVID-19 relief for renters is likely to come down the road from somewhere. There are a myriad of proposals in the state legislature to deal with the crisis, and if the federal government can get their act together, maybe they can help out too. But all that property owners have is this board. I think it was mentioned before that the Paycheck Protection Program specifically excluded rental businesses, properties from applying. So any COVID-19 relief that has been allocated for small businesses has not applied to property owners. And we know that just from this board's data, we know that property owners need a rent increase because operating costs have increased. Just from this board's own data, it shows about a 3% increase is necessary for a 1 year and a 6% increase is necessary for a 2-year lease renewal, just to keep up with operating costs. Now, to freeze rents under these circumstances would be a conscious decision to really ignore the data. And, it seems that it would be to either punish property owners or make some sort of political statement. But we don't think that that's this board's mandate. We think this board's mandate is basically to adopt a rent increase sufficient to keep a building's rental revenues consistent with increases in operating costs. It's just that simple. It's stated in the rent stabilization law. It's to prevent speculative, unwarranted, and abnormal increases in rents. The mandate is not to keep housing affordable. It's not to keep rents low for low-income people. It's not to relieve rent burdens. It's not to provide emergency relief to those who are experiencing financial difficulties because of COVID. I mean, when this board reports a 3.7% increase in operating costs, how can an equivalent rent increase be considered speculative, unwarranted, or abnormal? On the contrary, it's really just a rent increase necessary to keep small property owners in business. So despite this being a time where we kind of need to put politics aside, there are a lot of calls for rent freezes and using the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity to make this call, to push this political agenda. But calling for a citywide rent freeze without concern for the negative impacts on small property owners and medium-sized property owners is somewhat irresponsible, especially because these owners are already feeling the pressure. Their operating budgets are already seeing decline in revenues, and not just this year. This NOI has been decreasing the last 2 years. If you look at the 2018 I&E report, you see there's a chart that shows NOI was 64% above the 1990 level. That was in the 2018 report. If you look at the current report, NOI is only 48% above the 1990 level. That's a 16 percentage point drop in the last 2 years. And that NOI level in this year's report is actually approaching the NOI level that existed in 2016. Now, unfortunately, property owners can't say the same for all the expenses, property tax levies, any other expense for that matter. They're not returning to the 2016 levels. Expenses to run buildings are just not going down. And as net operating income continues to decrease, these owners are really put in a difficult place. It's not to say that tenants suffering from COVID-19 related economic loss shouldn't get relief. It's just our position that it's not this board's responsibility to provide it. I don't we don't think that this board is authorized to do so. And aside from that, just practically speaking, what would a rent freeze do for someone who has lost their job and can't pay rent because of COVID-19? Does it help them pay rent? Does it make sure that the business they work for or the company they work for reopens? It doesn't really do any of that, nor does the rent freeze target its relief to COVID-19 related hardships. It would apply to all 1 million rent stabilized units of housing, whether they can pay rent or not, whether they lost their job or not, whether they are getting more money from unemployment or not. Now, navigating this type of detail and nuance can be done through legislation or maybe even executive order, but certainly not through an order of this board. And we think that COVID-19 relief should be targeted in that way. And unfortunately, this board doesn't have the ability to do that. I just wanted to mention one other technical note. I know it's been mentioned before, but we wanted to raise it as well. We see no practical reason why rent increases adopted by the board should not also apply to vacancy leases. And sort of touching on something else that was mentioned before, allowing the guidelines to apply to vacancy leases as well reduces the increase necessary on renewal leases. And this is also in the own data. You can look at the commensurate increases in the PIAC report. But if you look at one of the commensurate increases, it calls for a 3.5% increase for a 1-year renewal and a 6.75% increase for a 2-year renewal. But if those increases are also applied to vacancy leases, the necessary increase is reduced. So in that example, if those also apply to vacancy leases, the data would call for a 3% increase as opposed to a 3.5% increase on 1 year's, and a 6% as opposed to a 6.75% increase on 2 years. Now, that's also pretty much because of the HSTPA. If you look in prior years, you will see that the difference between the straight commensurate and the commensurate with vacancy adjustments has a greater gap, because HSTPA allowed for that gap to be made up, so to speak, on vacancy with certain additional increases that no longer exist. So certainly the HSTPA, the impacts of that are already being seen just in this report, even though the data on the economic impact on the buildings isn't out yet. It's certainly impacting this board's decision. And I think that's all I have for you. Oh, I did just want to raise one other point. I know we're talking about DHCR data and data to get costs for capital improvements and renovations. If DHCR provides the board with some sort of universe of capital expenditures, not necessarily whether it be what they approved or what was applied for, at least that's something that the board can use to start some sort of analysis on how much capital budgets or capital expenditures are for buildings, so that we can start bringing that information into this board's deliberations as well. Because what's been happening is that those MCI increases, those get counted as building revenue, right? They increase rents, it inflates the NOI number, but the expenses that were spent on that capital project, the cost of that capital project, are nowhere to be found. So not only are you not counting the capital expenditures, but you're also counting the revenue that's generated from those capital expenditures. So it's inflating the revenue side and decreasing the expense side at the same time. So I just wanted to raise that as one of the inconsistencies that I hope we can try to address moving forward. That is my testimony. I'll submit a written testimony that has a little bit more detail in it, but I can get into that if there are any questions as well.
Questions for Joe? Andrew, would it be possible to pull up, I was trying to find it on my computer, but I'm juggling too many things at once, to pull up the chart that Joe referenced with the NOI over time. Do you have that handy?
Give me a second.
Thanks. Joe, what page was that on? Did you reference the page?
No, I did not reference the page, but I have it up. Too many windows open.
Tell me about it.
It is on page 11. Do you see it?
Yeah, I'm gonna put it up. Hold on one second. I think this is it, right, John? Yeah. So
Yes, that's it. So what I'm talking, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead. It's just this what the purpose of this graph is. It's a point-to-point look at the increase in income, rent, costs, and NOI from the first year that we have data, which is 1990, to 2018. So it's a point-to-point comparison.
Right.
So I think what Joe was pointing out was that in the 2018 report, which is calendar year 2016, I think he was referring to NOI. And there's a drop from NOI here, which was around 60%, I believe he said, to 48.7. It's it's inflation adjusted dollars, so that's why you're going to see different drops than in other parts of the report, because it's inflated. So but with inflation adjustment, there has been a decline from 2016 in NOI, and it probably has a level that was from 2000, below 2015, somewhere between 2014 and 2015.
Right. So the only reason I raised that is because I know we often look at just that now it's 0.6%. Last year it was like 0.04%, and we get focused on that a lot. But even just from this graph, it appears that NOI is dropping a little bit more drastically than indicated in those numbers. And I just wanted to point that out to the board, because because these numbers don't include the 2019 data yet, the data on building economics from post the HSTPA, which I think will continue to go down. But the trend has already started, and some of it has to do with some of it has to do with the fact that the HSTPA, when it was passed, it canceled the ability to take those vacancy increases. But there have been apartments, 5, 7, 10 years before that have been rented for the duration that will now no longer see that vacancy increase. So they don't have the ability to bump that NOI up, even though they've had this below market apartment that's been rented by the same tenant for the past 10 or 15 years. So that's why I know, some people may think it's anecdotal, but when you don't have the ability to raise those rents, the income you're just not going to generate it from anywhere else. So it's the trend isn't going to be easily turned around.
Joe, there was also another chart that you focused on from one of the reports, but I don't remember which one it was. What was that?
I don't know. Let me see.
All right, in the interim, does anyone else have questions for Joe?
Oh, I was talking about the commensurate adjustments. So I don't think that's in this one. That's in the PIOC.
Okay. All right, but I think we can, I mean, that's hard, that's easier to visual, those are just numbers, not actually is it worth taking a look at that up close, or I'm not sure that it is?
No, I mean, that's something I think the board members can look on their own, but you'll see, if you look at the difference between the commensurate, the regular commensurate and the commensurate vacancy increase in the 2020 year, and then say you look at it in the 2019 year, in 2019, the gap will be much bigger because this board had the statute in existence at the time gave this board more flexibility to keep renewal increases a little bit lower, because on vacancy the increases would be a little bit higher. But now you don't have that offset, so the renewal increases have to be a little bit higher because the vacancy increases are going to be a little bit lower. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joe's point is a really helpful one. Thank you for your testimony, Joe. But it is the vacancy lease and that allowing that to float up is a tool in the toolbox to try to do a lower increase at any time for the balance of tenants who aren't moving and who are staying in place. So I know we could all look at it, but I think since we have a little bit of time, I think it would be helpful, Andrew, if we could bring that up just to walk through those percentage differences and what the vacancy lease, how that tool works. Are you okay with that, David?
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. Maybe while Andrew's doing that, if anyone else has an additional question, feel free to jump in.
David, can we get a copy of Joe's testimony?
Yeah, I think when Joe, can you send that around now? Is that okay?
I'll send it, yeah.
Thanks.
Joe, if you just send it to Andrew, Andrew will circulate it.
Okay.
Can I make the same request for Vito to also share his written testimony? Because you mentioned
Shayla, I think Andrew may have, let me double check. I think Andrew may have sent it.
I did.
Yeah. Did you not get it, Shayla? Right around the time that Vito was testifying.
So I have to go to two separate reports. So to show this difference. But what Joel was pointing out was, I think he used the CPI adjusted commensurate, but
yeah,
without vacancy, the commensurates, which again are used for the board if they want to maintain NOI at the rate it is at.
But
it's not a recommendation of what the board should do. It's just these formulas are used if that's what each individual board member feels like is the importance of what the board should do.
Andrew,
but they're not recommendation by staff, but I just wanted to show that the CPI adjusted NOI commensurate adjustment without the vacancy was 3.5 for a 1-year lease. If you add the vacancy, it is 3%. And that was what Joe was pointing out, because we factor in, turnover and those new tenants coming in,
right,
and what their what the difference is between the tenant coming into the apartment versus the one that left. So,
Andrew, just to clarify, the commensurates really, and I'm asking as opposed to saying, but the commensurates are really like comparing revenue by a rent stabilized apartment to rent stabilized apartment. So if you had a mixed building of rent stabilized and market, the commensurate would overstate the amount necessary to keep NOI stable?
they're designed to keep the unit that's stabilized.
Generating the same ratio of income.
I can't say it's going to overcompensate. It depends what the market's doing, David.
That's fair. That's right. But it's,
So if the market is going down for the free market, then yeah, it would overstate. But if rents, are high, I mean, it would understate. But if rents are going up higher than stabilized units,
got it.
yeah,
I
then it's
understand.
over. So I don't. This is so to say that it depends on what's happening within that building.
Got it.
It's
I
marked
understand.
Units.
I think it might also depend where that rent stabilized rent is in comparison to the market.
Wait, play that out, Joe. Just explain that a little bit further.
Oh, so if you have a rent stabilized apartment that's renting for $1,650, and the market for that area for the same apartment is $1,700, let's say, the 3.5% increase would take them over the market. So they're probably not going to be paying that full 3.5%. But if that apartment was $1,000 and the market was 17, then obviously they would pay that full 3.5% increase. So that's sort of what I meant.
Mhm,
But the reason I was pointing this out is also to show that in the past, the board had sort of used the vacancy leases to, or the ability to increase rents on vacancy to give a lower rent increase than what the commensurate called for. So I just wanted to make sure the board knows that flexibility doesn't exist this year. That's all.
Other questions for Joe?
This isn't necessarily a question for Joe, but just a clarification on the report that I just want to make sure I understand. When it says the commensurate rate, does that mean that if the rents were increased by that 3 or 3.5%, whatever that commensurate rate is, that would keep the NOI equal to what the previous year was?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But Christina, just to be clear, that means if everything else remained the same. And
Okay.
I think Joe's point is there are fewer variables that could change rents. So really the main variable now is our decision. That's the main variable. Because a lot of other variables were removed by the law last year.
Okay.
So I feel like the commensurate is much more instructive because of the removal of all the other variables than it may have been in prior years.
Any other questions for Joe? Vito, should we turn to Jimmy?
Hello?
Hey, Jimmy.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you for presenting this today. I'm glad to see some of my old familiar faces there and a lot of new faces. I'm just glad everybody is safe and we're dealing with this upheaval in our lives. Hopefully it will be resolved soon. I want to express to everybody, first of all, who I am. I'm Jimmy Silver. I'm a third generation property owner, and we have a group called SPONY, which is the Small Property Owners of New York. It started in about 1980, and our owners are basically people who live in their own buildings. They do not have management companies. They take care of their own buildings. A lot of our owners, in fact, the supers in the building. These are smaller buildings. These are smaller buildings. The thing that with the thread they have in common is that they are older buildings. They are buildings that were built before 1947. Some of them are, in fact, turn of the century buildings. Some of our owners have 8-unit buildings, some have 12-unit buildings, some have 25-unit buildings. There's a wide variety. It's in every borough of New York. And the people that own these buildings, so you can understand where the makeup is of this entire sector of this community of property owners that are small property owners, is that many of our owners are immigrants. They came from, we have a lot of owners that came from the Caribbean islands. We have a lot from Haiti, Grenada. We have a lot of owners that have come from Greece. We have a lot of owners that have come now from the Balkans. There are a lot of Albanians that have come to the United States. And the thing that I think is important to know is that these owners because they live in their buildings, and many of them bought buildings because they needed space for their families. So they might have bought an 8-unit building knowing that they could take the ground floor apartment or one next to it and make space for their own families, so that these were their homes. Most of these people have other jobs. They do not rely solely on the income from the buildings to live. They have to subsidize these buildings by other jobs. And the fact is that we are friends and neighbors of the residents who live in our buildings. We all live under the same roof. We all want the same quality of living for our building. And as a result, it's the sociology of owning a building and living in it. And it is that you're dealing with people that are your friends and you want to work together. There's a feeling of community. And it's not at all the kind of thing you see in large buildings where you have absentee owners or big corporations. So these are the people that own our buildings, I would say, are the backbone of the community. And and they're very troubled now, as are all of the people who live in our building. Everyone is troubled, and we are trying to lean over backwards to help those that are terribly affected by this pandemic. We work tirelessly on an individual basis with people in our building to understand what their situations are, if they've lost jobs completely, if they've taken maybe just a decrease in salary and can pay a lot of the rent, but not all of it, or, and some, to be honest with you, some of our tenants have not been adversely affected because they work in industries like tech, or they work in finance, in mergers and acquisitions, and they're telling me that their businesses are even bigger than they were before, especially those in tech. Those, of course, who work in the restaurant business have been wiped out. Those who work in the entertainment business, in the event planning business, have been wiped out. Those who work in the travel business have been wiped out. So there's a broad range of how this pandemic is even affecting the economics of people in the city. And our owners have gone out of their way and are continuing to do this on a day-by-day basis to feel what is the individual problem, because you can't collectively say, if you have a building with 10 tenants, you can't collectively say that all of those 10 tenants have been affected the same way and are suffering economically and deserve a break. You cannot say that. It's not true. So I think for the individual owners like we represent, it gives us the ability to really have very good communication with our tenants and to give help where it's needed and to work out arrangements so that people can reduce their payment or delay it or pay it out over time. And that I think is the best approach to dealing with a situation like this. But on the other hand, I've got to explain to you the dilemma that the building owner that I've expressed to you is facing, because there are, has been said by many people, there are costs involved in running a building that unfortunately have not been reduced or deferred because of this pandemic. And these are costs that must be made without a doubt. They have to be met. And in the past, we always face this deal of costs going above income. But in the past, I want to just explain to you that the owners of these buildings had sources of income that, if the rent stabilized increases were not sufficient, and I just want you to know from the income and expense statement that you're looking at now, which was for the calendar year of 2018, the average cost the average cost increase in that report showed a 5.8% increase for owners. And yet, if you look back and see what the 1-year increase from the Rent Guidelines Board was to compensate owners for those increased costs, it was 1.25%. So there's a big disparity of what's been going on here in the last 5 or 6 years, that the increases that were intended to compensate owners, which is what the mandate was to create the Rent Guidelines Board, was that this board is a compensation board, that those compensation increases have not been near what the actual costs have been measured by the income and expense data. So right away, you have a problem for owners because there's a falling off of how their income is going to be adjusted to properly compensate them from the costs. But they had tools, owners had tools so that they could deal with this phenomenon that was happening with less increases than were needed. And there was a few areas that I just want to remind everybody of. There used to be a vacancy allowance, so that when an apartment became vacant, there could be a 20% or even larger if there was a longevity factor in it, which helped owners to compensate the income of the building for all of the rent stabilized tenants that have been there for years. That has been eliminated by the HSTPA. We no longer have any kind of a vacancy allowance. And when a rent stabilized apartment becomes vacant today, there is absolutely no increase, none. In addition, we had the high rent vacancy decontrol, luxury decontrol. So this was like a blood transfusion for the small building owner, because you have a 10-unit building and you have all stabilized apartments who have been not been getting adequate rent increases according to the costs data from the income and expense, and they're falling every year further and further below what a market value would be. And now all of a sudden, under the old law, you could get a luxury rent, high rent decontrol if the apartment went over a certain limit, and the apartment would not be stabilized. That was like, even to get one apartment like that in a 10-unit building has the effects of a blood transfusion, because it immediately injects extra cash into the building owner's ability to take care of the expenses. And HSTPA has eliminated that. In addition, many of our small buildings, 8, 10, 15, 20, have commercial space. And this income from the commercial space subsidized whatever shortfall there was in the Rent Guidelines Board 1-year increases. And when you look at the data from the that's presented this year from the income and expense data, it fully shows you on page 4 under RPIE study, rents and income, it shows you that the average rent for a stabilized unit of $13.97 is increased to $15.68 because there is on average $171 subsidy added to it from commercial income. And that shows from this study that owners that have the commercial space are getting 12%. They're getting an extra ability to collect 12% more from commercial income. This ability to collect commercial income is zero now. Every building that has stores, and we're not talking about like Apple and food markets. We're talking about mom and pop stores like the barbershop, like the shoe repair, like maybe a small coffee shop, a dress shop, a nail salon. These are the kinds of tenants that we have in our buildings that help us to subsidize the shortfall in the Rent Guidelines Board increases. This income is gone. It's gone, zero. There isn't one store paying. And the sad part of this is the future looks dismal. It's not going to be like, okay, next month we start opening up and everybody's going back and opening their stores and every store owner is going to pay rent to the owner. That is not going to happen because first of all, store owners are going to be restricted as to the number of people they can let in. If it's a restaurant, they're going to have half of the volume that they've had because they're going to have to separate tables and maybe eliminate a bar. So the income is not going to just all of a sudden be there for stores to say, okay, we missed 3 months. Here in the 4th month, here's your full rent. It's not happening. This is just not happening. And this is, to me, it looks like this is for the rest of this year, at least the entire year and maybe into next year. Who knows? There's so many unknowns dealing with this pandemic. But I don't think an owner today can count on getting any commercial income. And that's a big pitfall for us because that could be from 12% to 20% gone, totally gone. So you take that out of the equation, you take out commercial income, you take out no vacancy allowance on it when an apartment turns over, you take out no market rent apartments anymore. And you really are strangling the economic system for a property owner because his income is going to be vastly reduced, and yet his expenses are actually over leveraged. And I say that because we are paying real estate taxes in June. On July 1st is our next installment of real estate taxes. And we are paying real estate taxes this year in 2020 based on the income that we made in the year 2018, because that income in 2018 was reported on an RPIE filing in June of last year, and it takes effect this year. So we're paying taxes, real estate taxes, on a very large income from 2018 compared to today, which is tremendously, tremendously reduced. We could be talking about a building being assessed on a rent roll from 2018 and having to pay real dollar taxes this year when his income could be 50% less. And this problem that we're having this year with it drop off tremendously in income for the building won't be captured until next year, next June of 2021. The sad reality of all the lost income for buildings, for all real estate, for all building owners won't be captured until we file in June of 2021. And then it won't be applied in the form of a reduction in assessments until the following year of 2022. So you see what's going on? We're really putting property owners in a stranglehold position. And the sense is for all of our owners is that there's going to be a total collapse in this economic system of running your building because water and sewer taxes are not being discounted. They're not being deferred. The people who have labor, 32BJ union labor just got a 3% increase this week from a contract that was signed 4 years ago. They didn't waive the 3% increase. They didn't defer it. They expect the increase as of April 21st. So the components of running a building of labor, of real estate taxes, of water and sewer taxes, those are not being at all affected in a decrease or deferment or discount or abatement by this pandemic. And that creates a very serious economic situation for the small property owner, because it's just a matter of time until it doesn't balance out. And we don't know, the scary part of this whole thing is we don't know how we're coming out of this. We don't know if things will start to get back to normal and then there'll be flare-ups and then things will have to be shut down again. We just don't know. There's so much unknown. But what is known is that property owners need to make these fixed expenses or they run the risk of defaulting and possibly losing their buildings. And that's a terrible scenario because the tenants that live in my building love me, most of the people who are Spony members. And it would be a horrible situation if the owner could not make his real estate tax payment or his mortgage payment and went into default, and in the end winds up losing the building, because everybody suffers in that case. So I just want you to know that the horrible situation that we're confronting, the Rent Guidelines Board is supposed to compensate for the costs. And, not to do that, I think is going to really exacerbate the ability of owners to meet these expenses. I think everybody needs to work on this as a partnership. I don't think the Rent Guidelines Board, it's fair for the Rent Guidelines Board to come out and say, okay, we're going to have a rent freeze. I think there's got to be a partnership with the mayor and the city. And if there's going to be a rent freeze, then there has to be somewhat of a reduction in real estate taxes. So it's a pass on, that nothing works in isolation here. This is like an ecosystem, and we need a partnership. And you can't just say we're going to have a rent freeze without looking at the economic components of the taxes. And, we need to be a little creative. Maybe if a relief is wanted for October 1st, nobody even knows. It could be everyone's back to work in October and this won't be an issue, or it could be that it's worse and it's like it is now. We just don't know. So maybe we need to do some kind of a rolling increase, like you do a small increase for 3 months, and then we do a different increase for the next 3 months, depending on how the economy is reviving itself. I think we need to be creative, but I think we need, as I said before, we need to have a partnership. And that if there's going to be a complete freeze on rents, then there has to be an adequate response from the mayor in real estate taxes. So that's our story. That's the difficulty we face. And I guess that's about what I needed and felt I had to tell everybody.
Thanks, Jimmy. Questions for Jimmy? Leah?
Hi, thank you so much for testifying and coming out to testify. I have a question. We were talking earlier about anecdotal, and I wanted to ask you in particular, since you're a property owner, where is your building?
Mine is in
What neighborhood?
Greenwich Village.
Okay, and about how many units are in your building?
I have about 90.
And what's the average rent in your building?
Oh, I would say about maybe at 2,000 level. I have a mix of
In Greenwich Village?
I have a mix of stabilized, rent controlled, market rate.
So it's about 2,000 in Greenwich Village?
For regulated tenants.
Okay. I'm actually kind of surprised that it's so low, but I
have some regulated tenants that are paying $600. They've been there for 40 years. You know how the system works. Those rents, as in all small buildings where tenants tend to not move frequently, the rents are quite low. I have several that are under $1,000. It depends how many times the unit is vacated, of course, for what the rent then becomes. But I have a lot of original tenants. I have a lot of tenants who've been here 40, 30, 40, 50 years.
Which is a good thing. So it sounds like if it's about an average of 100 units and the rent regulated apartments, which are going to be lower than the market rate apartments, are about 2,000, then that would be at the least like 200K coming in.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow you.
It sounds like the net operating income could be at least 200,000.
From the regulated apartments?
Yes.
No.
We're
'cause
just
I-
trying to get a
I-
sense of, we have a lot of small business owners who that come up. And it is important for us to talk to you because this topic often comes up, and it often comes up without any sort of like tangibles. And in the way that it comes up is often like people are making nothing. And so I think, I wanted to provide some context as to why I'm asking you the questions, because I think, some people think small property owners, or maybe even small business owners are making just a couple of hundred, dollars a month. So again, it sounds like 200,000 at the least just for the rent regulated apartments.
No, that would assume that I only had 10 rent regulated apartments. I have more than that. I have about in the 30s. So we're talking about, if you're using 2,000 as a average, times 30 would be about 600,000.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for testifying.
Thank you.
And we certainly do appreciate your perspective, although we're obviously have different ideas about what we agree on, but we do appreciate your testimony because the narrative of the small landlord does come up a lot. And I think that it's important to have a sense of, as you stated, how much profits, if you will, or just income is coming in. And I think as you provided, it's quite a bit. Thank you.
But Leah, I don't think we have differences of opinion. I think we are on the same page that we want to help in a fair way. And we want to help tenants who are really stricken by this. We really want to. They're our friends. But we need the city to be a partner in this. It's not just you, and it's not just me and the Rent Guidelines Board, because it's much bigger than that. And we want, but for this to work, the city has to partnership with us. And they have to realize that they're taxing us on income from 2 years ago when everything was fine and dandy. And they're saying you have to pay that money. And there's no deferral. We're saying we want to do exactly what you want to do, and we want to work in partnership, but they're part of the partnership. And they've got to come forward and say, okay, we're going to have a 30% reduction in what you owe. And that could translate, since, the PIAC says that taxes went up 6%. So based on that, it's a 30% expenditure, that would relate to a 2%, just on taxes, that would relate to a 2% increase, a justified 2% increase for 1-year leases based on the PIAC. Okay, so that's what we need the city to do. If the city came and said, okay, everybody, we're going to reduce your building's taxes 30%, then that will enable me to give a 10% reduction to everybody in my building. That's the way this has to be looked at. It's a partnership, Leah. It's all of us working together for a common cause.
I'm sorry.
If all of us are working together for a common cause, then we should have a partnership and have a rent freeze.
So I'm sorry, there is some confusion about, rent roll and NOI here. What Jimmy laid out for you was revenue collected, not net operating income. And there's a difference, and you can't conflate the two.
I'm not conflating. I did say it's,
And then I
just to
think
have
it's
some kind of
it's
idea of
also
profit.
important for Jimmy to detail how much he's spending in property taxes as well.
I know, and I'm definitely not conflating, but I do want to point out, you know, we do have differences of opinion, and we can agree that we have differences of opinion. But I think in a strange and ironic way, there are some parallels in the argument. So for example, a few years ago, when we made the point that tenants are overburdened, then there was testimony saying that is not the goal of the Rent Guidelines Board to shift that burden to the landlord. That is for the Department of Labor and for labor issues, the city government, to increase wages so that tenants can afford their rent. And now that we're on the other side of a heavy crisis, now the argument is we're going to have higher property taxes, those are increasing, and so that burden should shift to the tenants, as opposed to the argument where that burden should really shift to the city government, where that argument should be taken up there, so that the city government could possibly lower those taxes, as opposed to shifting that burden to the most vulnerable people. So I think I wanted to point that out. And I do want to say, Jimmy, I do thank you for your testimony. We do have differences of opinions though. And I do understand and do appreciate that there are landlords that get along very well with their tenants. And I've certainly had them, and landlords that want to work well with tenants, and not everything has to be this acrimonious relationship. So that is certainly understood. I do think that what we're talking about is shifting the burden, and ultimately who gets to bear the brunt of the burden here. So I think that that's where we differ on opinions, but I do agree with you that it should be a partnership.
Okay,
Vito.
thanks.
I'm sorry, Vito, are you trying to get in a word? I'm just gonna ask Vito to speak.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't think it's fair to say there's a shifting of the burden here, because that's not the case. What we're saying is to look at data here that's saying that rent adjustments should be increased based on the data you have. And I know you could say, well, we have supplemental data that argues otherwise. And yes, we are in the midst of a crisis here. But what would the argument be had that information not been available if we weren't going through this right now? The fact of the matter is NOI has gone down. And it's a direct result of certain situations that have developed over the years, and property taxes and other costs are increasing as well. So we're not saying, hey, we need a rent increase here because of we're trying to force this increase onto tenants despite what they're dealing with because of this. This is what the board has to consider here. It's the real data that's put before them. The same way you're saying that not the federal government, that government should step in and attempt to alleviate the burden of taxes and water rates for owners, is the same way that government needs to step in here and provide relief for the tenants. It's not this board's job to provide relief through a rent freeze, because at the end of the day, that's not providing relief for anybody. Year in and year out, we sit at the public hearings of this board, and we hear that tenants are continuing to struggle with the same thing, regardless of an unexpected pandemic. There's clearly income issues, and the data from this year have shown that unemployment numbers were going to record lows, wages were increasing, and those are promising numbers that hopefully we can get back to once things get back to normal. I know you can't rely on that data right now because of what's out there and what we're dealing with, but at the end of the day, a rent freeze here is not going to provide any relief whatsoever, because even if a rent freeze is enacted in June, it's going to make a nice headline, but the rent is still going to be due in July, August, September, and even for tenants whose leases aren't going to be coming up for a while to reflect the rent freeze. So this isn't any relief whatsoever, and it's not a shift of a burden in any way. What we're saying is this board has a mandate to consider the data before them, and the data is saying owner NOI is decreasing and operating costs are continuing to rise. So even when the commensurate ranges are suggesting that a rent guideline has to begin here. It's not saying that, to shift any burden whatsoever. It's based on data.
What I am saying, and I think you articulated it as well, is that the same way that there can be an argument that there are increases in expenses and costs for landlords, so that is justification for why tenants should pay higher rent, is akin to the argument that tenants are not able to afford the rent, and therefore there should be a rent freeze. So there are parallels there in the arguments, and I'm saying that when one is undercut, there are two parallels in the argument. But we obviously have different viewpoints about it, but respectfully, thank you for your testimony and your viewpoints.
Jimmy, I had a follow-up question sort of Leah's. Is you had talked about the rent that you're collecting. I mean, given that the tax bills are due in about a month, I assume you have a fair idea of what that is if the bill hasn't come. I know some of our, where I work, some of our tax bills have already arrived. What is your real estate tax bill?
It's going to be $800,000
for the 6-month period or the annual?
for the 6 month.
So that's you said 8 months, so 1.6 for the year.
8 for the 6 months.
Yeah. Okay.
Due in June.
Yeah.
Other questions for our panelists?
So yes, Jimmy, hi, Cecilia.
Hi, Cecilia.
So I have a question. So the properties that you have is more small owners, right? And the owners are occupying the building. Do you have an idea what the percentage of individuals or tenants have notified you that they have lost income as a result of the pandemic?
It varies building by building. We're not able to keep like a running data count of all of this. It's just we're networking, we're doing, we're really communicating a lot with our owners. Some buildings are fine because the tenants, as I alluded to before, work in fields that haven't been affected, like technology. Technology people, even though they can't go in their offices, they're working like constantly remotely, and they have a tremendous amount of business that's been actually created by this pandemic. So it's a mix. It's hard to say. I can't tell you offhand like what percentage are asking for it and a rent reduction and what are, and it's impossible to really know.
Yes, so I'm talking about not everybody in the building, but I'm talking about the rent stabilized buildings.
Yeah.
How many have really shown? How many have contacted you? I know that a lot of them don't notify the landlords. Some of them they do. Sometimes they use third party, but just in general, I'd like to have an idea what percentage of your buildings have suffered loss of income.
Well, in my particular building so far, no stabilized tenant has indicated that they can't pay the rent. They have continued to pay it. Some have asked if we could, if the fear is if this lasts longer, because I think people seem to have like a reserve. If they've lost their job, they may be using some savings. They may, a lot of my people, a lot of my tenants have guarantors that their parents guaranteed the lease for them. And they look to their parents for help. And some of their parents live in very wealthy communities. So it's not always just the person whose name is on the lease. I have a lot of people who have guarantors. So they have help from whoever guaranteed the lease in their name. So far, I'm lucky that everybody has been able to pay the rent because I think everybody in some way or another is still working. They're working remotely, but they're able to work. In other buildings, I've heard from other owners that it's sort of a similar situation to mine, that most of the rent stabilized tenants have been able to meet their expenses and meet the obligation of paying the rent. It's looking forward, I think, that they're having fears, and how long is this going to continue like this?
Thank you, Jimmy.
Other
Jimmy,
questions for?
I have a question for Jimmy. Jimmy, do you have a sense? You said you have a lot of long-term tenants. Obviously we don't have a means tested housing, but do you have a sense of the means that are needed for these rents versus what the rents actually are, especially for your lower end?
Well, practically all of my longer term tenants are on scree. So their rents are frozen as far as what they pay. The difference is reimbursed to you in real estate tax. So, for that group of people, if this board gave a 2% increase, that would not come out of the pockets of the scree, my long-term tenants. It doesn't affect them at all. In a way, that would be a nice way to help owners, because you're giving an increase, and then the city government is then reimbursing you for that increase on your real estate taxes. So in that way, you're not, if the board does give an increase to that group of people on scree or DRE, they're not affected by it. The city is really, you're telling the city to help the owner in the form of the rebate. So, but for most of the older tenants in my building at this point, they're older, of course, because they've been here 45 years, they are on scree.
Yeah, I think that's a very helpful point, just in that, this board tends to be a dead end road where there's, I don't want to say garbage in, garbage out, but where everybody just throws their hands up in the air. It's like, oh, we can't fix this. There's no partnership to be had. I mean, the partnership is that we need means tested housing, so that the benefit gets to the right people. So we could all sit here and philosophically debate these issues till the end of time, but the city needs to provide subsidies for people who truly need them, people who got in at the right time and have second homes, and or maybe in a bigger apartment than they need because it's such a cheap price, are not who we're trying to administer benefits to. So I think the SCREE and DRE program are an example of where government is administering benefits in a prudent way. That program needs to be expanded to a lot more people that truly economically need it. So I wanted to ask you one second point, if I could just get one other one in. Could you just elaborate a little bit on the SPONY members' commercial space? Because I feel like, given the size of your building, a lot of these are single retail tenants that are, the retail tenants in many cases are probably not in a lot of different economic circumstances than your memberships, and that they're very small businesses that run on incredibly tight margins. What do your members say? How do they weather the storm where retail doesn't come back? I agree with you. It probably doesn't come back this year, and I think next year is a treacherous path.
This is a big dilemma, which I pointed out in my presentation, that this, so we have one owner down in Chinatown. He has a 20-unit building. He has 2 restaurants on the corner of his building, 2 Chinese restaurants in his building that subsidize him for his low rents. He's got all stabilized tenants. He doesn't even have a market rate apartment, but his building functions because of the commercial income that he gets. That allows him to put a lot of money back into the building and to make it a beautiful environment. You take that, it could be 20% income away from him, for how long, we don't know, permanently maybe. You take that away and the building is suffering. There is no doubt about it. Anybody who has commercial space that is going to suffer in his building.
Jimmy, quick question. First of all, thank you for your testimony. Just so I have an idea of who your members are, what share of your members have commercial space in their building?
I would say maybe a third would have commercial space. It depends, if if the building is mid-block, it probably won't have commercial space. If the building is on an avenue or on the corner mid-block avenue, they will definitely have commercial space. So it varies all around the city. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's basically the location of where your property is and whether it can be zoned for commercial.
Okay, so for that 1/3, they're able to, I mean, as you said, sort of cross subsidize between the commercial space and the residential spaces upstairs. How about for the other 2/3? Are the rents different there than they are for the 1/3 that have commercial space? I mean, it's like, do you know how that breaks down?
Well, the rents, everything is dependent on your location in New York, whatever the
Sure.
rental.
Yeah, of course. This is on average. I mean, it's I know that there's this wide
So,
variety. but
And for those, that the subset of buildings that maybe the third that have commercial space have an extra ability to finance, to subsidize expenses in their building because they have this commercial space. The others that don't have the ability to have a store, then it depends on how long their tenants have been there. Our typical building, say, is 10 years. So I'm thinking of owners that we have on the Upper West Side between Columbus and Amsterdam, where they have a 10-unit building. And in one case, the tenants have never moved. They've been there for years and years. So they're stabilized at low rents. So that's a very difficult building for this owner to manage. Probably the only reason why she keeps it is because she lives in it and it's her home. So she doesn't really think, she has another job. She doesn't think of it as, if she has to dip into her savings to repair a sidewalk, she kind of does it because she lives in the building and it's her home and that's something that she needs to do. If it's somebody who's not living in the building, then they're not going to make it. That's not economically feasible, and they'll probably give it up. Then it also depends on how many vacancies there have been in the last 10 years. If any of those apartments became vacant and the owner was allowed to get the rent over the threshold and it became a market rate apartment, then that changes the whole complexity of the building because it changes the cash flow. It's like a blood transfusion. So, each building is unique. It's hard to say. The common theme with the small owners buildings who live in them is that they're really well taken care of. And that ironically causes tenants not to want to move so fast because they have really nice homes and it's a nice little community. But the effect of that is that the rents don't keep pace with what the expenses are.
All right, thank you.
I'd like to just so other board members, especially the public members, understand, commercial leases, it's a similar concept to what Jimmy presented. Commercial leases, that the tax increases get borne by the tenant. So there is a natural safeguard that if taxes go up or taxes go down, the tenant has that benefit. So it is parallel to what Jimmy is saying, that if rent stabilized increases at least kept pace with tax increases, it would be a logical association. So I think that the commercial method is as much trouble as it's going to be to keep commercial businesses open. It's important people understand how those leases are structured.
I have a quick question. I think it might have been Joseph who testified that a lot of your members are like third, second-hand owners, like that inherited that, or maybe it was Mr. Silver. I'm sorry, who testified as to that? Because I'd like to ask a specific question. So Vito, for the members in your experience who are inheriting the properties the second time down, the third time down, are those people still paying mortgages?
Typically, there's it's a lot of the members at this point, they no longer have mortgages. The buildings have been in their families for over 50 years, but a lot of cases there have been refinances, and a lot of owners have put in a substantial amount of renovations in their building where there's additional loans and whatnot. So I mean, typically when we have our monthly membership meetings, the building owners who sit around the table and discuss their situations at those meetings, I would say almost all of them still have mortgages on their buildings in some degree.
Okay. So the expenses then some are mortgages, but for the ones where the buildings are second and third, like handed down, those expenses that the owners are looking at are mostly the taxes and the cost to maintain the building.
Well, of course, but
outside of the mortgage, I'm saying.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I had a quick question for Jimmy. So Jimmy, we missed you last year.
I'm glad you noticed I wasn't there.
I had a quick question about the numbers that you shared with us. So do you feel that, how many of the 30 regulated units that you have SCREE or DREE right now?
I would say third.
Okay. And do you feel that, you mentioned a few times that it feels like many of the folks that you're experiencing haven't been impacted by COVID. Do you feel like that's reflective of are they like younger folks? Are they in specific industries? I know that that's true for a lot of the buildings that we organize in the Bronx, where folks congregate based on, what's around them, right? Your cousin lives in a building and then another cousin comes in and lives in the building. I'm sure you have some of that set up in your buildings. Do you feel like that's what's happening in the building, or do you feel like there are younger folks who are coming to New York City for work, or college students? Can you give us an idea of, just for the rent regulated? I know there's a lot. It seems like out of the 90, only 30 are rent regulated, and only 20 are folks who are the folks who would be working in theory, right? Because SCREE and DREE, well, they could be working, but freezes their rent. So I think it's a little obsolete to talk about that specifically right now. Yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, the ones that aren't on SCREE have still been in the building a long time. It's not like they're really new people. I find in Greenwich Village, if you have gotten a rent stabilized apartment at any time, it's very rare that you give it up. The only time I ever see people really move out of rent stabilized apartments is if they're getting married and having children and need a bigger place, or they get transferred out of New York for a job. But if you're not in one of those two categories, I cannot remember anyone who has ever vacated a rent stabilized apartment. So we're not talking about really such new people that have come to New York. They've been here. And as far as the kind of work, I think that most of those tenants have been in the area of finance, because we're close to Wall Street, and I think they've been, sort of hedge fund people or Chase Bank, acquisition people. I think a lot of them have been in acquisitions and mergers, and they're telling me that their business has never been better. So go figure, in this crazy pandemic, how people are so busy in acquisitions and mergers. I was really shocked. I didn't think that could possibly be, but it is. And then I have people that I guess also besides the finance, I have a lot of people that work in technology. And they're very busy. They're telling me that their business has increased. So for those two specialties, I see that they're doing quite well. I don't really have people who are waiters, or, I think that industry is decimated. I feel so sorry for them. the, the entertainment business and the restaurant business and the travel business. It's like, wow, it seems, and retail, I think, anybody who's worked in retail, like somebody who worked as a buyer in Bloomingdale's, like maybe gonna have trouble. So those people, it's so split, Shayla. It's like there's no one size fits all to this. In this pandemic, I mean, everybody. It's definitely that everybody is suffering and affected because the way we do life is completely different. But the economics for people doesn't seem to me to be one size fits all. That everybody is hurting. Conversely, some people are doing, as they've told me, are doing much better. So it's a crazy time, and all I can tell you is what I experienced from my encounters with the people in my building.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think one of the reasons, and not trying to throw shade on any of the past folks who testify, I think that there's a warmth and a way that you look at your tenants that is different than how we tend to have conversations about tenants and landlord relationships. And so I really do appreciate that. And thank you for that. But I on the same side, I think that, your building is an example of a building that, that we consider as like bigger building, right? Like it's a bigger building in retrospect, and like
Right.
where it is, the location. And so I think that, like, for me, it's like, how do I take all of the warmth and amazing work you're doing in your buildings to make sure that happens, while also recognizing that that was a 90 unit building that was rent stabilized, and we've lost some of those units. And so how do I, as a tenant representative, also make sure that I'm balancing and making those arguments, because it is an important argument to be making, that majority of the units in your building, for example, aren't regulated, and that, the folks who do live in regulated buildings tend to have incomes that are a lot lower, as you probably can assess, than folks who can make the market rate tenant buildings. And I think that that is an important thing to highlight, because we are talking about one size fits all. And I think as a board, and I've tried to do this in the past, but like we should be having conversations on, is there segmentations based on number of units in buildings, based on, the cost of that specific buildings or those makeups. And, I'm open to having those conversations. It just feels like we really need to, the argument that you were making on like the folks who were impacted and who maybe weren't impacted are the folks that we are talking about, right? And so those, restaurant workers that you acknowledge are hurting, those folks who have the low paying wage jobs are the folks that we are concerned, I'm personally concerned about, while also balancing that, we want buildings to be healthy and safe for tenants as well as owners, and anyone who comes in contact with them. And so thank you so much for your work. Try not to miss any year, because then I notice.
Thank you. Thank you for all the effort you put in. I know you put a lot of energy into this, but I agree with the things that you've said, but it highlights for me that this system would work much better if we could target those people that you're talking about and have an income means test and identify the people that you're talking about may be different from the people who are living in my building. And we need more help for the people that you're dealing with in your area than the people maybe that are living in my building. So one size fits all, I don't think, and I think this pandemic maybe highlights how inaccurate and inequitable it is to have a one size fits all. Some people are absolutely hurting, as you deal with. Some people are not hurting in stabilized buildings, like some of my tenants. So why should those people who are not hurting in tech and acquisitions and mergers, get more of a subsidy? In a way, there's the subsidy that would be directed to them shouldn't be, and it should be directed to the people you deal with, because they're more deserving. And there's no way really for any of us on the Rent Guidelines Board to figure out who is more deserving unless we have a means test, unless we can identify the recipients of this subsidy. And I think for all fairness and to help so many of the people that you're talking about, it would benefit them to an extremely, that extra monies that are being diverted to subsidize people that don't need it can go to them. And maybe it can be a double subsidy for them. That's my thinking on it.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. I think that the point where we differ is that there is from the owner side, and many of the folks who have testified today have mentioned this, that there is an expectation to have NOI remain the same. And I think that, the Rent Guidelines Board is supposed to stimulate a fair, balanced, market. And I think that in other parts of the country that don't have rent stabilization, we see those discrepancies look a lot harsher. There's negotiation that happens, right? If the house next door is going for a certain price, the house, that you're renting, they know like what the area sort of looks like, and people make decisions, they can haggle. Rent stabilization allows for some of that. And, I'm sure that you can acknowledge that a lot of tenants have preferential rents as a result of that, right? Like it didn't happen by accident. Like owners were working with their tenants. And I think that's something that we definitely appreciate. But I think that the challenge for me specifically is like, how do we see what the market could bear? Like, we are in a society where, you can charge $800 for a t-shirt and also $1 for a t-shirt. And so I think that's the world that we exist in. I think that the tenants that we're talking about, and most of the tenants that we have data on, specifically our rent stabilized tenants, like their incomes aren't like, $80,000, $90,000 a year. That's not like the folks that we're talking about, because they look different on the rent stabilized side. And I think that that's an acknowledgement to like the differences of when we say things of who's being impacted. For me, of like, when you're making $30,000 a year and you don't work for 4 months, your recovery time, as we know, many New Yorkers are paycheck to paycheck. And so that is harder for someone who was making $30,000 and someone who's making $100,000 so they see a decrease in their income. And that isn't to say that the pain isn't the same, but I think that there is an understanding that like, people across the world are hurting. And I think COVID is just making it, like you mentioned, showing us how bad it is. And I think that like when we join in our lobby in Albany and with the city government, I hope that owners will continue to support things like Scree and Dree, but I think that still deregulates and also makes rents unaffordable to other New Yorkers. And so I think for me, it's like, we could say, let's not think about Scree or Dree tenants. For me, it's like 10 years when that unit is no longer available for someone who has Scree or Dree, that tenant is paying that high rent. And so what New Yorker, in a building where we're organizing can pay $2,300 a month when, that Scree tenant moves out and they no longer, and they're making $30,000 a year. Like that, I think is the nuance that I think we're trying to get at. And we won't capture it on this board, but I think that I appreciate being able to have this conversation, but at the same time, also acknowledge that, many folks across the city are hurting, and the same arguments that we can make for owners, we can make for tenants. And then that balance is like, where do we give and take? Because within the confine, and you guys remind us of this every year, owners do, is that we need to look at this year. We need to look at the data as if right now. And I think that loses sight of the fact that this data is coming as of from a rent freeze, 2 years of rent freezes, and that we see the data that NOI decreased a little bit, and that's maybe not necessarily the intention that the board had. I think many of us have different feelings about what that was for. From my perspective, it was really to make sure that we are thinking about NOI not remaining stagnant for all landlords, because not everyone is hurting the same. And when we had the crisis in 2008, we also saw rent increases. We didn't see tenants get relief, even though we knew that they were hurting. And I hope that we don't make the same mistake with this crisis. I think that we have to look at all the points that you brought up, while also balancing, I think our overall mandate, which is to stimulate a fair market in the city, which doesn't exist in New York.
So it's a little bit after 12, and we have scheduled an hour break, which I'm guessing some people are looking forward to. Is it okay if I call this a break? And I'm going to say thank you to Vito and to Payman and to Joe and to Jimmy for participating in this thoughtful conversation. And we'll reconvene at 1 unless I hear some protest from anyone on the board. Great. All right. Thank you so much for participating.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.